I remember the first time I saw the void beyond the Manufactorum skylights. The stars weren't stars, they were pinpricks of cold indifference, endless distances where even the Emperor's light barely dared to reach. And then he appeared, not a hero, not a champion of the Imperium, not even a skidare, though he moved like he knew the rhythm of death and laughter alike. He was impossible, a being out of time, out of logic, cracking jokes as if reality were a playground. In the midst of battlefields soaked in promethium and ash, he leapt between orcs and servitors, a whirlwind of irreverence in a galaxy governed by solemnity. Every pulse of the Vox grill that tried to warn us of incoming fire became a punchline. I don't know if the Custodes would have sanctioned his presence, or if the Inquisition would have burned him on sight, but he was there, and I couldn't look away. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I look into this endless void, and I see that 99% of you wander these stories but never swear your allegiance. If you stand with me among these tales of war, faith, and fire, then subscribe. It means more than you know. It helps these chronicles of the Imperium reach others who still remember what humanity once was. And tell me, from which world, hive, or system do you watch? I always read your messages. It reminds me that even across the stars, the spirit of mankind still listens. The sky above Forge World Griffon was a bruise of gray, a suffocating ceiling that reflected the fires below. Smog rose in twisted columns from shattered manufactorums, blackened and smoking, where promethium spilled freely, igniting in short, furious bursts. The hives trembled with the constant rhythm of the Astra Militarum, boots pounding on girders, Vox grills screaming commands across the smoke-choked corridors, and artillery cannons rattling against the fragile crust of the planet's surface. It should have been the kind of day when soldiers whispered prayers to the Emperor before crossing the next slag-strewn street, expecting nothing more than survival. And yet, nothing about this day was normal. He appeared first as a blur, a red streak moving against the muted palette of ash and steel. Some called it a hallucination, the strain of constant combat bending perception into grotesque shapes. But then a voice cut through the clamor, irreverent, impossible, a voice that laughed where death hung in the air like smog. He vaulted over a chain of skidharai, taunting them with a gesture, tossing one servitor like a rag doll into a pool of burning promethium. Sparks flew from exposed wiring. The machine servitor did not even register injury before collapsing in a tangle of limbs. The soldiers froze, some reaching for their last guns, others dropping to their knees, unsure whether to shoot, flee, or pray. He did not wait for permission. Explosions became his drumbeat. The roar of orc gunfire became background music. Even the nearest artillery crew, trained for efficiency and precision, found themselves starring as he danced across the battlefield with impossible grace, deflecting shrapnel with sheer instinct, leaving behind a trail of chaos in crimson and steel. The Mechanicum's data slates blinked with error codes, recording actions that should not have been physically possible, movements that defied every law of physics the tech priests thought unbreakable. And yet, every impossible feat was accompanied by a quip, a snarky remark shouted into the face of the universe itself, as if he mocked the very idea of fear or death. Corporal Ilias of the 74th Cadian Regiment muttered a prayer, clutching the melted remnants of his helmet, and swore he saw a warp glimmer in the air where the mercenary landed. Psychers on the front line, sensitive to disturbances in the immaterium, convulsed briefly, claiming the laughter ripped through their skulls like fingers of fire, a psychic resonance unbound by reason. No one knew if it was a trick of the warp, or just the effect of staring at something beyond comprehension, something the Imperium's liturgies and doctrines had never prepared them for. Through the smoky haze, the orcs bellowed, charging with crude weapons and crude joy, yet even they hesitated. Their warbosses barked orders, but the red-clad figure moved between them, hurling a rocket like a ball, spinning in midair, and landing in the midst of a squad to deliver a punchline that left more than one greenskin unconscious. The battlefield, a landscape of fire and iron, was no longer a place of tactical engagement. It had become theater, absurd and horrific, where the line between survival and spectacle blurred. By the time the smoke cleared around the upper spire of the forge, a single squad of Skidara had regrouped, watching from the shadows. Their augmented eyes scanned the battlefield. Servitors, orcs, and humans alike lay scattered, burned, or otherwise incapacitated, yet the red streak had not a single mark. The tech priests whispered among themselves, their litany of obedience faltering, wondering if this was some warp-born anomaly, a demonic trick, or the return of a hero who had never existed. Rumors began before anyone could speak. A being out of time, a mercenary who existed only to sow confusion and defy order. And yet, for all the chaos, the soldiers felt it too, the strange pulse of exhilaration, a forbidden grin tugging at the corners of even the most disciplined faces. In the shadow of Prometheum fires, with ash drifting like snow over broken catwalks, a single truth became clear: nothing would ever be the same on Griffon. Even the Imperium, with all its structure, discipline, and liturgies, could not prepare for him. He was impossible. He was red. He was laughter wrapped in death, and in a galaxy where hope was rationed and faith enforced, he reminded everyone in the most terrifying way that unpredictability still existed, even here, among the stars and spires of steel. The distant drums of artillery and the scream of distant orc engines signaled the continuation of the battle, yet the mercenary disappeared as suddenly as he arrived, leaving behind scorched earth, whispered rumors, and the nagging sense that reality had just taken a punch to the gut, and it had laughed. The Mechanicum does not sleep. Its gaze is constant, its logic unbroken, yet even the Skidara, those tireless, augmented servants of the Omnissiah, noticed something amiss that day. Sensors blinked in confusion, cogitator arrays buzzed with error signals, and the data slates trembled as if recoiling from reality itself. Every movement recorded, every trajectory plotted should have been accounted for. Yet the red-clad figure defied every calculation, moving faster than even their most precise algorithms could predict, turning the battlefield into a living equation they could not solve. From the shadows of a ruined forge tower, veteran Dominic watched, his ocular implants whirring as they tried to track the impossible mercenary. Sparks danced across his lenses, reflections of fire and Prometheum smoke distorted the landscape. Servitors nearby repeated the same protocols over and over, attempting to engage this anomaly, yet each effort ended the same way: a crushed limb, a scattered circuit, or a perfectly timed quip that left the mechanical minds in error. Dominic adjusted his Vox grill, trying to report the events, but each message came back garbled, fractured by some interference in the warp, or perhaps by the very being they observed. The Adeptus Mechanicus had never encountered anything like this. Across the battlefield, other Skidara squads mirrored their comrades' unease. Data slates recorded feats that should have been impossible: hand-to-hand combat against entire orc mobs with no injury, propulsion leaps that violated known physical laws, and, most perplexing, a strange laughter that seemed to resonate in the very circuits of their augmentations. Veteran Dominic murmured the litany of pure thought, but his bionic limbs twitched involuntarily, as if even his body rebelled against the order he so desperately tried to enforce. The tech priests convened in a hallowed chamber, cogitators humming as they attempted to discern patterns. Hypotheses ranged from warp-induced hallucination to some heretical flesh-bound demon, yet nothing fit. Servoskulls scuttled along ledgers and schematics, recording every explosion, every misfired Prometheum flare, and every impossible leap. Dominic's sensory feeds caught glimpses of Vox signals distorted by laughter, and he realized that the creature, if it could even be called that, was not merely present. It was rewriting the battlefield, bending logic, reshaping cause and effect. Even the servitors, mindless and obedient, began to falter. One attempted to raise its lasgun at the mercenary and collapsed mid-motion, circuits sparking, joints seizing. Another tripped over its own chassis, the servo harness grinding as it hit the ground. It was as if the very laws of obedience themselves had been tested and found wanting. Dominic noted each failure, each error, and cataloged them meticulously. Perhaps, he thought, this was some divine test, or an aberration that the Omnissiah had never accounted for. Outside the chamber, the battlefield continued its chaotic rhythm. Orc gunfire erupted, promethium flares ignited in quick succession, and the red-clad mercenary twisted through it all like a living paradox, deflecting bullets, dodging explosions, and leaving a trail of awe and devastation in his wake. For the Skidharai, this was more than a tactical anomaly. It was an existential one. Orders, protocols, and liturgies, the core of their being, were failing in real time, and no amount of reasoning could reconcile what they witnessed. By the end of the day, veteran Dominic recorded one final note in his data slate. The subject moves not with intent but with purpose, yet his purpose is incomprehensible. He does not kill as we do. He does not conquer as we do. He exists between calculation and chaos, a variable that cannot be quantified. Outside, the fires of the forge world burned brighter, smoke curling into the sky. Somewhere above, the red figure disappeared into the distance, leaving the Skidharai with an unsettling truth. The Imperium had always measured the universe in absolutes, but absolutes had no meaning here. The whispers among tech priests grew louder, some claiming it was a fragment of the warp, others daring to hope it was a remnant of a forgotten hero. Yet no consensus could form, no plan could contain him. For the Skidharai, the battlefield had become a lesson in humility, a proof that even the most disciplined minds of the Mechanicum were vulnerable to the unexpected, to the unpredictable, to the laughter that defied death itself. And in that silence, broken only by distant explosions, one thought remained. If he could not be stopped, could he ever truly be understood? The vox grills of the 93rd Cadian Auxilia screamed across the forge world, but the transmissions were fractured, warped, as if some invisible hand had twisted the signals into nonsense. Orders became echoes, warnings became riddles. Every attempt to coordinate defenses against the orc warbands, already on the verge of breaking, failed. Soldiers reported hearing laughter through the comms, a sound utterly alien yet unmistakably present, bouncing from channel to channel with increasing frequency. Some swore it was a psyker's hallucination. Others muttered prayers to the Emperor, certain that their souls were being tested. Yet the laughter was real, tangible, and impossibly persistent. Sergeant Ulrich, one of the few officers still capable of coherent thought, crouched behind a collapsed support beam, clutching his vox grill like a lifeline. "Do you hear it?" he hissed to the man beside him. His voice trembled, a rare break in the discipline the Astra Militarum demanded. The other soldier, eyes wide and unblinking, nodded. It was everywhere, through artillery signals, through servitor relays, through the hollow echo of empty streets. Even the cathedrals of steel, massive and unyielding, seemed to vibrate with its cadence. It was a rhythm that defied logic, warping perception and twisting fear into something else entirely: awe. The red-clad mercenary moved through the chaos like a shadow dancing on fire. Orc choppas swung, servitor limbs lashed, and promethium flares exploded, yet he emerged unscathed each time. Soldiers attempted to take him down with lasguns, plasma, and grenade volleys, but each effort dissolved into farce. The vox waves themselves seemed to reject violence against him, scrambling coordination and feeding the anomaly further into the warp of perception. Psykers at the rear convulsed violently, screaming of visions where the battlefield was no longer physical, but a hall of mirrors, endless corridors of ash and laughter, reflecting their worst fears and deepest uncertainties. From the upper galleries, Commissar Varos observed the growing breakdown of order. Every disciplined formation unraveled. Squads went rogue, chasing shadows, firing at phantoms. Even the most faithful men of the Imperium questioned their senses. Reports reached him that the mercenary had, against all odds, held back an orc war boss with nothing but a pair of stub pistols and one-liners sharp enough to cut steel. And in those moments, whispered rumors began to circulate. Perhaps this was not a man at all, but a warp-born trickster, a fragment of some forgotten legend, or an agent of chaos whose purpose remained beyond comprehension. The warp, it seemed, was responding to him. Signals distorted, psychic feedback pulsed, and anomalies erupted where the red-clad figure had passed. Servitors nearby began to malfunction, some turning against their masters, others repeating the same motions endlessly. Ulrich noted in his log that even the most robust cogitator systems could not reconcile the feedback. It was as if reality itself were bending to accommodate a presence it had never encountered, a presence that insisted on ignoring the rules of war, physics, and discipline. By midday, a pattern, or what appeared to be a pattern, emerged. Wherever he moved, the impossible followed. Orcs stumbled, human soldiers hesitated, and the warp seemed to flicker. Rumors spread that he had touched the Imperium without intending to, leaving tremors of raw, chaotic energy that even seasoned psychers could not measure. And yet he laughed. That laugh, slicing through Vox grills and brain waves alike, became the strange heartbeat of the battlefield. Soldiers began to imitate it subconsciously, whispering it under their breath even as they fired, a grim acknowledgement that defiance and survival had become inseparable from the absurd. By nightfall, Griffon was a planet of fractured order. Fires burned, shadows twisted, and the mercenary, red, irreverent, and impossible, vanished into the smoke and ruin as suddenly as he had appeared. Vox channels remained garbled, sending fractured reports into the void. Survivors, whether Skidhare guardsmen or tech priests, recorded their observations meticulously, unsure whether to call it a battle or a dream. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fired blindly, striking nothing but ash and echoes. And for those who had seen him, heard him, and survived the day, one truth lingered like smoke in their lungs. The universe had introduced a variable that could not be calculated, predicted, or controlled. The Imperium's doctrines, its litanies, and its endless rules of order were powerless here. Reality had been punctured by a singular absurdity, and through that puncture came the first whispers of a question that would haunt the Forge world for years. What truly was this creature, and why had it chosen Griffon as its stage? By the time the first tendrils of warp storms curled over the horizon, rumors had already begun their flight through the void. Scouts, Vox operators, and wandering mercenaries whispered of the Red Mercenary, a being who moved faster than bolter fire, who survived where others fell, and whose laughter could fracture the minds of even the most disciplined soldiers. The stories spread in fragments, embroidered with fear, awe, and disbelief, carried from one hive world to another with the momentum of wildfire. Each retelling grew stranger, each observer adding details that made him larger than life, a legend in motion, impossible to cage in words. On the Forge world itself, tech priests combed the battlefield for physical evidence. Cogitators hummed and sparkled with corrupted data, Vox logs flickered in erratic bursts, and servoskulls scuttled through the ruins, attempting to reconcile impossibility with doctrine. Some whispered that the mercenary was a fragment of the warp, a psychically unmoored entity that existed only to sow chaos in the name of some cosmic joke. Others dared to speculate more dangerous ideas, that he might be a lost agent of a forgotten Mechanicum experiment, an unrecorded hero of legend, or perhaps even a manifestation of a forgotten fragment of the Emperor's will, twisted by time and war. The Imperium, as always, responded with bureaucracy first, then fire. Orders from nearby hive administrators demanded reports, containment, and if necessary, the elimination of the threat. In practice, these directives dissolved into absurdity. No regiment, no squadron, no squad of Skidhare could approach him without being disrupted by his improbable speed, sharp wit, and uncanny awareness of battlefield dynamics. Soldiers who survived encounters described him speaking directly to them, as if reading thoughts and exploiting fear, hope, and desperation alike. Many swore that he could vanish into thin air, leaving only smoke, laughter, and the lingering smell of promethium. Across the sector, news reached hives and manufactorums untouched by the immediate battle. Merchants and miners, patrols and wayfarers repeated the fragments with embellishments. A fight against orc mobs that left the greenskins fleeing in terror. A duel with a rogue servitor battalion that ended with circuits fried and limbs strewn artistically. And most absurdly, a wager made with a war boss that involved no weapons, only cunning, mockery, and the mercenaries' inexplicable charm. Each account, though unverifiable, added to the mythos, solidifying the Red Mercenary as a figure whose presence defied both logic and hierarchy. Even the Adeptus Astartes, briefed only in fragments by Imperial command, could not reconcile him with known forces. Chapters whispered in their strict codes about a being beyond comprehension, a chaotic variable that violated centuries of combat doctrine. Tactical councils faltered. Plans were abandoned mid-execution. And through it all, the mercenary seemed unconcerned, almost amused by the reverence, fear, and awe he inspired. It was as if the galaxy itself had become a stage for his private performance, one that the Imperium could neither sanction nor ignore. Yet not all agreed on his nature. Some tech priests insisted he was a warp-born anomaly, an aberration that would vanish when confronted with sufficient firepower. Others, more cautious, feared that such assumptions were the beginning of heresy, that to define him was to tempt the very forces that shaped him. Soldiers and civilians alike began praying, not for survival, not for victory, but for understanding. And in the silence between explosions, in the faint glow of distant promethium fires, a single unifying truth persisted. He was a rumor that had stepped into reality, an impossible variable whose reach extended far beyond the forge world, into the countless hives, manufactorums, and void lanes of the sector. By the end of the day, whispers solidified into legend. Records on Griffon were already fragmentary, marred by errors that could only have been caused by someone, or something, who bent reality to his whim. Scouts returning from neighboring worlds spoke in hushed tones of sightings, a blur of red against smoke, laughter carried across Vox signals, impossible feats of agility and destruction. And in every account, whether told in fear or admiration, one certainty remained. This was no ordinary mercenary. He was a force that could not be contained, measured, or predicted, and the galaxy would never forget the day he arrived. The sky over Griffon had turned to molten steel by mid-morning. Promethium rivers ignited spontaneously, the wind carrying the acrid stench of smoke, burning flesh, and scorched machinery into every spire and hive street. Artillery boomed in irregular rhythm, deafening, shaking the very ground beneath the soldiers' boots. Orc warbands surged relentlessly, their guttural cries and crude engines echoing against the steel canyons. And somewhere in the eye of this inferno, he moved, red, impossible, laughing. Astra Militarum squads fell in disciplined formations, only to break as he darted between ranks, deflecting blades, dodging bolter fire, and leaving orcs dumbfounded in his wake. Sergeant Ulrich tried to rally his men, shouting over the cacophony, but even he faltered. Their enemy, in theory, should have overwhelmed them by numbers and firepower, yet it was not just the mercenary's skill. Something about him distorted perception. Bolter shots veered off course. Explosions that should have torn through armor fizzled harmlessly, and in the distance, artillery shells inexplicably detonated early, showering orc mobs with fragments rather than fire. Tech priests recorded the anomalies with trembling hands. Data slates lit with unreadable code, servoskulls shuddered and sparked. Veteran Dominic's ocular implants could not track him. Each time the mercenary moved, his trajectory seemed to split into multiple, impossible vectors, defying both calculation and reason. Dominic noted in his log, "He is both here and not here, moving in patterns the omnissiah cannot define. Observation fails, logic fails, yet the world bends to him." The battlefield had become a living experiment, and he was the variable no calculation could constrain. Amidst the chaos, civilians and laborers who had not yet fled huddled in collapsed manufactorum alcoves, staring wide-eyed at the spectacle outside. They witnessed orcs being disarmed, thrown, or driven back with laughter as their only foe. Fires cast grotesque shadows against the walls, promethium flames licked the steel girders. And all the while, the mercenary moved as though the inferno were a playground, weaving between explosions, quipping, taunting, mocking, leaving devastation behind that no human hand could rationalize. Even the orc warbosses grew cautious, barking orders to their mobs that were met with failure after failure. Weapons jammed inexplicably, mobs stumbled over debris he had flung with a casual gesture, and every tactical advantage they believed they held dissolved under the weight of unpredictability. Their roars of rage became frustrated squeals, their crude ingenuity overwhelmed not by force, but by the sheer absurdity of his presence. The battlefield became theater, and he, the actor who controlled every scene. By the day's end, Griffon was a landscape of fire and ruin. Manufactorum smoldered, streets were rivers of molten metal, and the dead and wounded littered every level of the hive's spire. Yet, through it all, the mercenary remained untouched. Soldiers whispered, eyes wide, that they had seen him leap over explosions, dance between falling girders, and vanish into smoke only to appear elsewhere as if the world itself had folded around him. As night fell, the promethium fires cast an eerie glow across the ruins. Vox channels were silent but for static, and the only sound beyond the crackling of flames was a distant, echoing laughter. Soldiers and tech priests alike recorded the impossible events, certain that history would remember the day Griffon burned, and the red mercenary danced amidst the inferno. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the orc mobs regrouped. Distant artillery fired blindly, and the mercenary disappeared as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving nothing but chaos, whispers, and a world forever changed. Even amidst devastation, one thought remained, unspoken yet unanimous. The Imperium had not faced a variable like him before, and nothing would ever prepare it for what came next. By the time the Psykers reached the command spire, the atmosphere had changed. The air itself seemed charged, a subtle vibration beneath the smoke and steel that whispered of something beyond comprehension. Alarms continued their ceaseless drone, but for those sensitive to the immaterium, the vibrations were far more than warning signals. They were a resonance, a pulse, a laughter threading through the veil between reality and the warp. The red mercenary had moved beyond mere physical presence. He had become an anomaly, a vector that tugged at the very fabric of perception. Chief Psyker Lavox shivered as he felt the first tremor of psychic backlash. He had trained for this, endured decades of exposure to the warp in controlled environments, yet even his disciplined mind teetered on the edge. "It's playful," he muttered to his acolyte, voice trembling. "A taunt, perhaps, but from where?" The acolyte, pale and shaking, did not answer. Even their amplifying lodestones could not filter or quantify the pulse. The immaterium itself seemed to shiver under the mercenary's influence, bending thought and probability alike. Across Griffon, soldiers reported similar phenomena. Lasguns misfired, bolter rounds scattered in impossible arcs, and servitors ceased to function in synchrony. In the ruins of a collapsed manufactorum, a squad of guardsmen swore they saw a fragment of red streak past them, multiply in impossible ways, each iteration laughing. One soldier collapsed to his knees, muttering prayers to the emperor that tumbled into nonsense. Yet in that chaos was clarity. The universe had shifted, however briefly, to accommodate him. The orcs, for their part, were equally unnerved. Their crude understanding of the universe could not account for a being who moved faster than thought, survived impossible encounters, and seemed to manipulate the very warp with unintentional precision. Warbosses barked orders that went unheeded. Mobs scattered without reason. Explosions occurred in defiance of trajectory. Even the most battle-hardened greenskins hesitated in fear, or perhaps awe. The battlefield had become a liminal space, neither fully real nor fully imagined, and the mercenary occupied its center with unshakable ease. Psyker and soldier alike began to whisper rumors, desperate to explain the incomprehensible. Some claimed he drew power from the laughter itself, bending the warp to mock reality. Others dared to suggest he might be a fragment of a forgotten legend, an ancient agent of the Emperor whose existence had been erased from records, now manifesting in flesh and fury. Regardless of theory, one truth remained. Where he moved, the warp followed, resonating with a chaotic harmony that no imperial doctrine could predict or contain. By nightfall, Griffon was a fractured tableau of fire, steel, and echoes of laughter. Vox channels were scrambled, sensors flickered with impossible readings. The red mercenary moved through it all, leaving behind not just destruction but uncertainty, an infectious question that spread faster than Promethean flames. What is real, and what exists only because he wills it so? The tech priests cataloged anomalies, marking coordinates of impossible trajectories, psychic tremors, and fractured artillery patterns, but no pattern was complete. It was as if the battlefield itself were a living puzzle, and he the only mind capable of navigating it. Veteran Dominic recorded the day's final observation in his log. The subject manipulates not with intent but by existing. Laughter, chaos, reality itself bend around him. Observation fails, comprehension fails. He is a variable outside the parameters of the omniscience logic. And somewhere beyond the glow of fires and shattered manufactorums, the mercenaries' laughter continued, echoing through the void, through the warp, through the minds of those left to survive. In the quiet, the thought of his next appearance became a pulse of dread and anticipation. For those who had glimpsed the impossible, survival was no longer a certainty, it was a gamble, and the universe itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for him to act again. The Inquisition does not tolerate variables. It punishes aberration with absolute authority, dispensing justice measured in fire, faith, and when necessary, exterminatus. Yet even the most seasoned agents paused when reports of the Red Mercenary reached their ears. Witnesses claimed he was both everywhere and nowhere, laughing in the face of death and reshaping battles as if reality itself were a plaything. Such things did not exist, or at least, they were not meant to. And yet the evidence was irrefutable. On the spire of the Hive Administrator's command center, Inquisitor Kale stood motionless, eyes narrowing behind the ceremonial respirator mask. His aides whispered, nervously recounting fragmentary Vox reports, survivor logs, and the scattered accounts of tech priests. "It cannot be," one murmured. Kale's gloved hand tapped the armrest, sending a faint vibration through the steel chair. "Yet it is," he replied. "And if it moves unchecked, every hive in this sector will fall into legend or heresy. We act." The Ordo Hereticus dispatched a team to investigate the psychic distortions, while the Ordo Xenos prepared contingencies for potential alien influence. Each agent approached Griffon with the same rigid caution that had ended countless threats in the past. But here, caution faltered. Nothing about this mercenary adhered to any doctrine, any law, any litany of logic or faith. He moved through Promethean fire, orc warbands, and Imperial artillery alike, unscathed and unbothered. Within the ruins, agents observed from shadowed vantage points. Servitors reported anomalies in the warp, and psychers convulsed as they attempted to trace the mercenary's presence. Inquisitor Kale recorded his observation. The subject is not merely a soldier nor a demon. He exists as an agent of entropy, a force that mocks expectation. We cannot predict him. We can only observe and contain if necessary. The word, contain, felt fragile. The reports that followed described impossible feats. Deflecting bolter fire with a grin, dismantling an orc assault with nothing but wit and timing, and disappearing mid-battle, leaving no trace beyond fire, smoke, and laughter. Field operatives tried to engage him directly, deploying squads with orders to immobilize, capture, or eliminate. Each attempt failed in spectacular fashion. Lasguns misfired, servitors malfunctioned, orc mobs scattered in ways that made no sense, and always the laughter echoed, threading through the warp, threading through Psyker's visions, threading through the minds of soldiers too disciplined to question it. No plan could account for him, no doctrine could bind him. The mercenary existed outside their measures, and the Inquisition felt the rare, unsettling chill of impotence. Whispers circulated among the inquisitorial teams. Was he a fragment of the warp that had assumed flesh? A lost hero of the Emperor's past, unrecorded and irreverent? Or something far more dangerous, a living question meant to challenge the Imperium's assumptions? Each theory carried its own risk, and no choice seemed safe. Kale, despite his centuries of training and experience, acknowledged the impossibility aloud. We act against him, yet all action is reaction. He defines the battlefield, not we. And he may define more than that before this day ends. As Griffon burned beneath the twin suns, artillery continued, orcs regrouped, and soldiers scrambled to survive. Kale made the decision that would echo across the sector. The Red Mercenary would not be ignored. The Inquisition would intervene. But the question remained. What exactly could the Imperium do against a being that defied every rule, every law, every expectation? The answer, like him, was uncertain. And somewhere in the ruins, Red moved like a living spark, laughing at the universe's attempts to impose order. The Inquisition's agents did not yet know whether to pursue him with fire, faith, or fury. Perhaps all three would fail. The aftermath of the mercenaries' passing was both destructive and strangely precise. Entire manufactorums lay in ruin, twisted steel and molten promethium pooling like rivers of fire. Orc warbands that had stormed the spires were scattered or incapacitated, some fleeing in terror, others frozen mid-assault, bewildered by the chaos he left in his wake. The Astra Militarum, battered but alive, emerged from collapsed streets with staggered formations, faces smeared with soot, blood, and disbelief. And through it all, the Red Mercenary was gone, leaving only whispers, smoke, and an unsettling sense of inevitability. Corporal Ilias surveyed the destruction, Vox Grill crackling with static as he tried to report the status. "Sir, it's like he didn't even fight like a man," he muttered, eyes wide. "He rearranged the battlefield, made us survive, made them fall, and he laughed the whole time." His words hung in the air like embers carried by the heat and smoke, impossible to dismiss. For all the fire, the wreckage, the death, there was a strange order to what he had wrought, a pattern too subtle to describe, too chaotic to ignore. In the aftermath, the tech priests scoured the ruins, cataloging anomalies, damage patterns, and remnants of impossible feats. Data slates whirred with conflicting records, unable to reconcile cause and effect. Servitors shuffled mechanically among the rubble, some recording, some malfunctioning, others simply stopping to observe the strange geometry of destruction. The Omnissiah's logic struggled to explain the impossible. It was not just collateral damage, it was collateral divinity, an unintentional artistry wrought in fire, steel, and laughter. The orcs, for their part, fled toward distant spires, some swearing that the red figure had mocked them personally, tossing them aside with a grin and a word they could not understand. Their roars of anger became confused squeals as the survivors of Griffon attempted to regroup. Even veteran soldiers found themselves shaken, unsure whether to fight, flee, or bow in silent acknowledgement of the mercenaries' chaotic mastery. Reality itself had been rearranged by a single agent, and survival seemed less a matter of strategy than of timing and comprehension. Amid the ruins, whispers of impossible events spread like sparks in dry promethium. Some claimed he had single-handedly saved entire squads by intercepting orc charges with nothing more than precise timing and audacious improvisation. Others insisted he had altered the trajectory of artillery, diverting blasts away from human ranks with inexplicable finesse. Each account, though impossible to verify, strengthened the legend. Soldiers began speaking of him as if he were a divine messenger, though no one could decide whether the divinity was intentional or accidental, benevolent or mocking. Even the psychers were unsettled. Vibrations from the warp persisted, subtle and pervasive, threading through the minds of all who had witnessed him. Some muttered that he had touched the Imperium without effort, leaving behind echoes of power that reshaped probability. Others feared that these anomalies were the beginning of a larger, more dangerous influence, an enduring chaos the Imperium had yet to understand. All agreed on one point: Griffon would never be the same, and the memory of the Red Mercenary would linger in minds, machinery, and warp signals alike for decades to come. As night descended, the fires of the Forge world painted the ruins in crimson and gold. Soldiers huddled, murmuring prayers to the Emperor, while the tech priests documented the impossible geometry of the destruction. Somewhere beyond the horizon, distant artillery fired aimlessly into the dark, and orcs regrouped in silent fury. And in the stillness between explosions, a single thought persisted. The Red Mercenary had acted without malice, without intent, and yet the consequences of his passage had been nothing short of divine. Griffon survived, battered and broken but alive. And for those who had seen him, the galaxy had been reminded once more. Some forces, some variables, and some legends exist beyond doctrine, beyond war, and beyond comprehension. The story of Griffon spread faster than wildfire through the Imperial communication networks, carried by scribes, vox reports, and frightened survivors. By the time the accounts reached hives and manufactorums on distant worlds, the Red Mercenary had already become something more than a man. A question, a paradox, a disruption to faith itself. Citizens whispered in hushed tones, soldiers murmured prayers not to survive but to understand, and psychers trembled at visions that refused definition. Faith, once rigid and unyielding, began to splinter. On the hive world of Seraphis, a preacher agonized over the texts of the Adeptus Ministorum. The accounts described a being who could evade death, defy doctrine, and manipulate the battlefield in ways that seemed impossible without sacrilege or sorcery. Could this be a sign? The preacher whispered, voice trembling. A test of faith, or a warning of heresy we cannot yet name? No answer came. Only the echoes of Prometheum fires and distant artillery that seemed to follow the mercenaries' path, even across the light years. Even within the ranks of the Astra Militarum, doubt took root. Officers who had survived Griffon's chaos struggled to reconcile their experiences with the doctrines they had been drilled into since childhood. Lieutenant Merc of the 109th Cadia Brigade noted in his log, "The enemy fell, yet the battlefield itself defied comprehension. Orders issued were meaningless, yet somehow survival was granted." Faith in the Emperor is tested not by failure, but by understanding that the impossible exists. Soldiers murmured under their breath, the words half prayer, half wonder, questioning whether the Emperor's light had sanctioned the mercenary or merely tolerated him. The tech priests struggled as well, grappling with anomalies that defied the logic of the Omnissiah. Data slates flickered with impossible calculations. Servoskulls refused to comply with programming, and cogitators emitted static bursts that could not be reconciled. One senior mago speculated in a rare moment of unguarded thought that the mercenaries' actions might represent a fragment of divine will, or a fragment of the warp masquerading as divine intervention. The distinction mattered little. Both possibilities undermined the certainty upon which the Imperium relied. Even whispers from Terra began to circulate in secret archives. Scribes debated the implications, some arguing that the Red Mercenary could be a litmus test for faith across the sector. Was obedience still meaningful when confronted with the impossible? Did doctrine survive when reality itself could be bent by a single agent? The answers were neither simple nor comforting. By the time the reports reached the Administratum, it was clear that the Imperium faced not just a battlefield anomaly, but a crisis of perception and belief. Among soldiers and civilians, psychers and tech priests, the same realization took hold. Survival alone was insufficient. Understanding, explanation, or containment seemed forever beyond reach. The Red Mercenary had acted without clear intent, yet his presence fractured faith, disrupted doctrine, and introduced doubt in every mind he touched. And somewhere, always just beyond comprehension, he moved on, leaving a trail of questions that could not be answered by prayer, logic, or fire. As Griffon's fires died down and survivors tended wounds, both physical and spiritual, one truth became undeniable. Faith in the Imperium, once absolute and unquestioned, had been fractured. The Emperor's light still shone, yes, but a shadow lingered in its brilliance. The shadow of a being who acted without malice, without allegiance, and yet whose mere presence tested the very foundations of belief. Across the sector, the whispers persisted, carried on vox channels, in hidden chapels, and along the corridors of manufactorums. The Red Mercenary had become legend, yes, but more than that, he had become a mirror, reflecting doubt, awe, and impossibility back into the hearts of humanity itself. Weeks passed, yet the echo of Griffon's fires lingered. Rumors hardened into reports, reports into records, and records into legend. Across the sector, commanders, tech priests, and psychers spoke in hushed tones of the Red Mercenary, whose presence had shattered not only the battlefield but the very expectations of those sworn to order. Where he moved, chaos and improbability followed. Yet within that chaos, there was a strange sense of purpose, a rhythm that none could replicate or predict. The Inquisition, still pursuing fragments of his trail, found only scattered evidence: scorched walls, shattered servitors, and the occasional token of mischief. An orc banner thrown improbably atop a manufactorum spire, a lasgun aimed at nothing but air, a single bolt of promethium igniting in mid-flight. Agents recorded the phenomena, attempting to define and contain him, yet each approach failed to yield understanding. He was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to engage without falling into the patterns he dictated. Even the strictest protocols of the Ordo Hereticus faltered, yielding frustration and whispered awe in equal measure. Across Hive Seraphis, civilians recounted tales of his feats with reverent fear. Some swore that he had saved entire squads with nothing but a grin and impeccable timing. Others insisted he had danced through fire, evading orcs, artillery, and promethium-fueled infernos as if the world were made to amuse him. Yet no mortal witness could explain why he moved this way or what drove him. The stories grew, each iteration more elaborate, threading the impossible with human memory, shaping a narrative that blended legend with eyewitness account until the two were indistinguishable. Even within the Adeptus Mechanicus, speculation ran rampant. Magos Dominic, reviewing the flickering data slates from Griffon, muttered into his robes, "The subject is a variable beyond comprehension, yet he shapes the world around him with precision. Perhaps he is a fragment of divine calculation, or perhaps merely a trick of the warp. Either is terrifying." Servitors shivered at his words, circuits buzzing as if acknowledging a truth they could not process. The battlefield, long cleared of living combatants, remained etched into memory as a theater of impossible geometry, where fire, steel, and laughter were inextricably intertwined. Across the stars, psychers felt tremors in the warp, subtle but persistent, like distant laughter threading through the immaterium itself. Some whispered that the mercenary's presence had altered probability on a scale far greater than a single battle, leaving echoes that would persist, influencing events in ways no human mind could fully anticipate. Even the most disciplined psychers hesitated to speculate, fearing that nomming him or defining him would invite the warp to correct their assumptions in unpredictable ways. By the time night fell on Griffon once more, the legend had crystallized. Stories of impossible survival, uncanny foresight, and laughter that twisted perception were repeated in vox channels, whispered in cantinas, and recorded in clandestine logs. He had become more than a mercenary. He was an agent of unpredictability, a mirror to the Imperium's rigidity, a reminder that some forces could never be controlled, only witnessed. Soldiers who had survived the inferno spoke of him as if he were a divine jest, while the orcs and rogue servitors remembered only fear, confusion, and awe. And in the quiet, amid the smoldering ruins of Griffon, one truth persisted. The Red Mercenary had acted without allegiance, without malice, and without clear purpose. Yet through his actions, he reshaped the battlefield, fractured faith, confounded doctrine, and imprinted himself upon the memory of all who witnessed him. The universe has been reminded that some legends are neither heroes nor villains. They are variables that defy understanding, and in that defiance, they endure forever. The Red Mercenary had vanished, but his presence lingered like a pulse beneath the stars. Griffon's surface was scarred, its manufactorums twisted, its streets littered with debris both human and orc. Survivors wandered among the ruins, haunted not only by what they had endured but by the impossibility of what they had witnessed. The world itself seemed altered, subtly, as if the fabric of reality had been bent and released, leaving faint ripples in every corner. Even the most disciplined Astra Militarum units moved cautiously, uncertain whether to fight, flee, or bow in silent acknowledgement of an impossible agent. Across the sector, reports continued to arrive, fragmented and embellished, carried by couriers, vox channels, and wayfarers. They told of sightings on distant moons, fleeting glimpses through warp storms, and encounters that left soldiers questioning their own perceptions. Some claimed he saved squads as a byproduct of chaos, others that he defeated threats with mockery and cunning rather than force. Everywhere he passed, uncertainty spread alongside survival, and the boundaries between legend and reality blurred. The Imperium's chroniclers struggled to document him, but every record contained gaps, contradictions, or anomalies that defied explanation. In the hallowed halls of the Inquisition, Inquisitor Kale studied the compiled reports, voice low and tight behind his respirator. "He cannot be contained," Kale murmured to an aide. "Not by fire, faith, or fury. He is an equation we cannot solve, a presence that bends rules and perception alike. The Imperium's certainty is meaningless in the face of him." His aide dared not respond, and the room settled into tense silence, broken only by the hum of machinery and the distant, ever-present echoes of impossible laughter. Among the tech priests, Magos Dominic cataloged the last data slates from Griffon. Servitors continued to twitch in minor malfunctions, unable to reconcile cause and effect. Dominic recorded one final note: "Subject acts without malice, without intention to command, yet leaves order and chaos entwined in equal measure. Reality itself conforms briefly to his presence, then resumes its course, altered but intact. Observation fails. Comprehension fails. He remains beyond the Omnissiah's logic." Even the priests' devout minds shivered at the admission. The sector's psychers reported faint tremors in the warp, subtle threads of resonance that seemed to ripple outward, touching distant hives and manufactorums. Some whispered that his passage had left a permanent mark, an imprint upon the immaterium that would endure long after Griffon had healed. And those who had witnessed him firsthand spoke in hushed tones, rarely to the uninitiated, of the strange combination of levity, precision, and absurdity that defined his existence. To call him a mercenary was both accurate and insufficient. To call him a legend was to misunderstand his subtle, disruptive nature. As the sun set on Griffon, casting long shadows across the ruined spires and molten Prometheum rivers, one thought resonated through the minds of all who remained. He could return at any moment. Perhaps for aid, perhaps for amusement, perhaps for reasons no one could ever discern. The Imperium had seen many things, yet none like him. Somewhere in the infinite expanse of stars, the Red Mercenary moved, laughing quietly, leaving traces of chaos, wonder, and impossible survivals in his wake. And in that realization, every soldier, psyker, tech priest, and civilian understood the truth. Some forces in the galaxy exist not to conquer or serve, not to protect or destroy, but to remind the Imperium of its limitations. Some variables cannot be calculated, some legends cannot be controlled, and some laughter echoes across stars, weaving impossibility into the very fabric of existence. The Red Mercenary was gone, but his shadow among stars would endure, forever altering perception, faith, and the measure of what it means to survive in the grim darkness of the far future.